There's a scene that plays out far more often than most people realize. A man spends years working toward a financial goal. He finally reaches it, and just a few months later, he realizes something no one ever had the courage to tell him. Life doesn't look anything like he imagined it would, not because he failed, but because he begins to experience changes that were never mentioned in any personal finance book, any course, or any of the success stories everyone loves to talk about. This may be one of the least discussed topics in personal finance. Everyone teaches you how to earn more, how to invest better, how to build wealth. But almost no one talks about what actually happens when money finally stops being a constant source of stress. And maybe that's why so many men spend decades chasing a goal without ever realizing how deeply it can transform their lives. If you're a man who wants to understand money on a much deeper level than most people do, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because today you're going to discover 5 changes that almost no man expects to experience once money stops being a problem. And more importantly, why understanding those changes may be far more valuable than simply building a bigger net worth. From a very young age, almost every man learns to chase the same promise. The promise that there's a moment in life when everything will finally make sense, when his career is where it should be, when his bank account reaches a certain number, when life finally looks the way it's supposed to. It's an idea so deeply ingrained that almost no one ever stops to ask where it came from. They just keep running, as if there's an invisible finish line waiting for everyone. What's interesting is that no one describes that finish line the same way. For some, it looks like an important position. For others, it's respect, freedom, recognition. Every man builds that image a little differently, but almost all of them share the same belief, that once they finally get there, something essential inside them will finally be resolved. The problem is that this image usually remains surprisingly vague. It changes over time. It moves farther away every time it seems within reach, and yet it continues to be the destination so many men dedicate decades of their lives to pursuing. Maybe that's exactly why so many wake up early, work hard, and keep pushing forward, without ever clearly defining what they actually expect to find at the end of that journey. And before we understand why so many men spend their lives chasing that destination, and what really changes once they finally reach it, there's something even more interesting to uncover. Why do so many of us admire successful men? Without realizing we may only be looking at the least important part of their story? There's something interesting about the way men tend to admire successful people. When a man looks at another man who's reached the level of success he'd like to achieve, he almost always pays attention to what he can actually see. The way he dresses, the way he speaks, the way he works, the habits he shares, the opinions he posts, the places he goes. All of it seems to offer important clues about how that life was built. But there's one detail that usually goes unnoticed. We almost never meet these men at the moment their lives actually began to change. We only meet the version of them that has already made it to the point where the world can see them. It's like picking up a book that's already in its final chapters and believing you understand everything that happened in the hundreds of pages before, or watching only the last few minutes of a movie and assuming you know the entire story. Naturally, that creates an illusion, because the things that catch our attention the most are usually the things that appeared after that man's life had already changed. While the less visible moments, the ones that actually changed the direction of his life, rarely receive the same attention. And that's exactly why so many men develop an incomplete picture of what it really means to reach that level. They see the results, but they rarely see what truly transformed the way that man lives. And that incomplete picture creates another interesting consequence. It leads almost every man to imagine the exact same scene when he tries to picture what life would be like if money finally stopped being the center of all his worries. To help you picture this more clearly, I want you to do a quick exercise with me. Imagine that starting tomorrow, money was no longer something you ever had to worry about again. What's the very first image that comes to your mind? It would probably look a lot like what almost every man imagines. A bigger house, a different car, more vacations, clothes from brands that once felt out of reach, maybe even working fewer hours. It's interesting how whenever we picture a financially comfortable life, our minds almost always jump to things people can actually see, as if the biggest proof that a man has made it is whatever everyone else can notice. But what if none of those were actually the first major change? What if they weren't even among the most important ones? Because there's a huge difference between what changes the appearance of a man's life and what changes the way that life is actually lived. The biggest changes rarely attract attention. They don't show up in photographs. They don't fit inside a garage. They aren't displayed in a storefront. In fact, many of them go completely unnoticed by anyone looking from the outside. And all of this only reinforces why most of us have a completely distorted picture of what really happens when a man reaches the point where money truly stops being a problem. We imagine the visible changes first, when in reality the most important transformations usually happen in places no one else can see. And that's exactly why the rest of this video may surprise you. Because when money finally stops being a problem, five things begin to change, and none of them are as obvious as they seem. This is where most men start to get surprised. To begin with, one of the very first things that changes is his understanding of what actually needed to be fixed. Let me explain. For years, many men go through life believing that nearly all of their problems have the same root cause: money. If they could just earn more, everything would get better. The conflicts would fade, the anxiety would disappear, happiness would increase, life would finally fall into place. And honestly, that's an understandable expectation. After all, when almost every decision revolves around your budget, it's only natural to believe that fixing your finances will fix everything else. But something interesting happens once money stops being the center of your life. The financial problems really do get smaller. The others don't. Relationships still require maturity. Your health still depends on the choices you make every day. Discipline is still necessary. A sense of purpose still has to be built. These are the kinds of problems money alone simply can't solve. For the first time, it becomes obvious that some of the biggest challenges in your life were never waiting for a bigger paycheck to disappear. They had simply been hiding behind financial pressure all along. And that may be one of the most important discoveries a man ever makes. Money solves a lot of problems, but it also reveals the ones it never had the power to solve. After that realization, a second transformation begins. For many years, a large part of that man's decisions were driven by necessity. Staying in a job that drained him, agreeing to opportunities that didn't really make sense, putting up with situations that no longer matched the life he wanted for himself, not because they were good choices, but because they felt like the only choices available at the time. Once money stops being a constant source of stress, one word starts to take on a completely different meaning: the word no. For the first time, he realizes he can turn things down. He can say no to work that drains his energy, no to partnerships that don't make sense, no to opportunities that offer money but demand too high a price in peace of mind, time, or quality of life. And that change is much bigger than it seems, because a lot of people think financial freedom means being able to buy whatever you want. But for the man who actually reaches that point, the greatest feeling is usually something else. It's having the power to stop accepting what once felt unavoidable. That's what real freedom actually means: the moment a man gets to decide what deserves his no. But there's a third change that almost no one talks about, and it may be one of the most unexpected. Many men imagine that financial success simply makes other people admire them, as if recognition were the biggest consequence of becoming financially successful. But in reality, what usually happens is that expectations grow. Now people expect him to solve problems, to lend money, to help financially, to always be available. Suddenly, the stability that once seemed like a personal achievement starts influencing everyone around him. Some people see opportunities. Others simply begin to believe he has an obligation to carry responsibilities that never existed before and that were never his to carry in the first place. And that completely changes the way he has to set boundaries. Because the less money occupies his own thoughts, the more it begins to occupy the expectations of the people around him. That's why so many of these changes remain invisible. They don't show up in photographs. They don't attract attention on social media. But they profoundly change the way a man lives every single day. Up to this point, every transformation we've talked about has happened inside his life. But there's an even more fascinating change ahead. It's not him that changes. It's the way he begins to look at the future, and more importantly, the way the world itself starts responding to his presence. It's fascinating to see how dramatically this changes the way a man relates to time, and how the world begins responding to him differently. Before becoming financially successful, thinking about the future meant dealing with worry, next month's bills, the fear of losing his job, unexpected setbacks that could erase years of hard work, the constant feeling that one mistake could be incredibly expensive. That's why so many men end up trapped in the short term. Not because they don't have dreams, but because the urgency of the present consumes all the energy they have. It's hard to plan the next 10 years when you are still trying to survive the next 30 days. But once that financial pressure disappears, the future stops feeling like a threat and starts becoming a tool. For the first time in a long time, that man can think 5 years ahead without anxiety, 10 years ahead without fear, 20 years ahead without feeling like he's imagining an impossible life. His decisions are no longer made just to put out fires. Now they are made to build something. Every choice begins serving a bigger purpose. Every year stops feeling like another year that simply passed by. Instead, it becomes part of a direction he consciously chose. That may be one of the biggest differences between a man who's constantly under financial pressure and one who no longer depends on money to dictate every decision he makes. Wealth doesn't just increase the size of your bank account. It literally expands your horizon. It allows a man to stop asking, "What solves my problem today?" and start asking, what makes the most sense for the life I want to build 10 years from now? But there's another change that almost nobody talks about, and it happens in the way the world responds to your presence. Most people never notice it because it's an incredibly subtle transformation. He's still the same person. He still speaks with the same voice. He still believes in the same ideas. Yet somehow those ideas begin producing a different effect. The same opinions receive more attention. The same advice carries more weight. The same decisions inspire greater confidence. Not necessarily because he suddenly became smarter, but because financial success consciously or unconsciously changes the way people perceive credibility. Whether we like it or not, the world tends to associate financial success with the ability to make good decisions. And honestly, that's one of the changes very few men anticipate when they imagine a life where money is no longer a constant concern. Now, after looking at all of these changes, one question naturally comes up. What do all of them have in common? At this point, it's natural to feel like we've been talking about 5 completely different transformations. At first glance, they really do seem unrelated. One changes the way he sees his own problems, another changes his ability to say no. Then come the expectations of the people around him, his relationship with the future, and finally the way the world responds to his presence. But if you look a little closer, it becomes clear that all of them came from exactly the same place. None of these changes happened simply because that man made more money. The biggest transformation happened when money stopped controlling the decisions in his life. When a man is still struggling financially, almost every choice he makes is a reaction to bills, to emergencies, to limitations, to the fear of not having enough. Once that pressure disappears, something much bigger happens. For the first time, he stops living in reaction to circumstances and starts living by choice. Notice how that connects everything we've talked about so far. At the core, none of these changes are really about wealth alone. They're all about autonomy, about taking back control of your own life. And that may be the biggest realization in this entire video. Wealth change is far less about the size of your bank account and far more about who's in control of your decisions. Because as long as money controls your choices, your life will always be organized around your circumstances. But when you take that control back, money stops deciding who you have to become and starts serving the man you've decided to become. And after everything we've talked about, it would be easy to come to one conclusion. To think this video was about rich men, about people who managed to build significant wealth, or about those who reached a financial level that feels far removed from the reality of most people. But that may be the biggest misunderstanding of all, because the truth is, this video was never really about wealth itself. It was about what happens when a man no longer spends every single day with his mind consumed by financial stress. Notice that at no point did we talk about a specific net worth. We never mentioned the perfect salary. We never defined some magical number in a bank account, because that was never the point. The real purpose was to understand why so many men spend years thinking about how much money they want to have, yet rarely stop to think about the kind of man they hope to become once money is no longer the center of their lives. Maybe that's exactly why so many people spend decades chasing a financial goal, without ever asking themselves what kind of life they actually want to build after they reach it. Because when that vision doesn't exist, it's easy to turn money into the destination, when in reality it was always supposed to be the vehicle. And that may be the most important shift in perspective of all. At the end of the day, the most important question was never, how much money is enough? It was always, what kind of man do you hope to become once money is no longer the problem? The real goal was never simply to make more money. It was to build a life where money no longer gets to decide every choice you make. Because once that happens, the biggest changes don't just show up in your bank account. They show up in the way a man thinks, makes decisions, plans for the future, and leads his life. And in the end, that may be the achievement that's truly worth pursuing. Now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Which of these changes surprised you the most? Or is there another transformation you believe happens when a man no longer has to constantly worry about money? Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely read everything you write. And if you're a man who wants to build wealth wisely and develop a healthier relationship with money, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We still have a lot more to talk about.